So this leads me to the question about the design of your initiative, the cooperative. I really like the idea actually when I'm just now thinking of the idea cooperative. If the classical labor struggle is about ownership and about the control of means of production and also control of the condition of work, today's problem is operation, is not ownership, right? And this is number one. Number two, we think why Uber and Lyft, and also we have Didi and Grab in Asia are very powerful. Because they have the capacity of operation. It's a huge app. You need a huge number of skilled workers, of course, the cloud, the computer system, and this hardware infrastructure to operate the platform, right? So my question is that number one, so I think it's very interesting the shift from the question of ownership and to the question of operation. And now we have cooperation, right? Cooperative. So I'm just, how do you design that? And especially I'm curious about the infrastructural question. I mean, can cooperative compete with all these giants in terms of how can they maintain the platform in order to deliver, efficient and seamless services for the users?
Well, one of the things that has shocked me about this project the most, I think you could say that there's a lot of Marx in this project, but there's also a lot of Adam Smith in sort of fascinating ways, which is that one thing that shocked me in putting this together, my own journey, I went from being a union organizer, and I still consider myself a union organizer, to being a cooperative business developer. Which is very similar, I believe, in that you're bringing people together for a common purpose, developing a shared vision, and figuring out how to get there. Except in the case of a union, what you're producing is just a group that's going to take action in concert. And usually, as a union, it's a relatively sort of blunt force instrument of a strike or a protest or potentially potentially something more complicated, a comprehensive campaign. We're using different tactics. And I don't mean to diminish at all the complexity. Building a union is extremely challenging. I think it actually is maybe even more challenging than building a company, frankly. But building a company is very similar, but you're figuring out the question of how do you get ownership of sort of the tools that you need to produce something, and then how do you set them in motion? So how did we do that? I think that I've had multiple kind of discoveries in this process. One of the discoveries was that, the biggest barrier to workers starting companies is that workers don't have capital. I mean, it's a sort of definitional question. Like, if you are a worker because you don't have capital, if you had capital, you would be a capitalist. Definitionally, if you own the capital, then you make income off the capital. If you don't own capital, you have to sell your labor to survive. So how do you get out of this chicken and egg? Well, what I realized was that most people starting companies, they have some capital, but it's not like the people who had Uber started off with billions of dollars. They started off with an idea, and they got people to believe in it. And what they believed in was that this product that they were going to create was going to be that there was a demand for it that'd be widely adopted, and that if an investor put in a certain amount of money, it would lead to some kind of success where they'd be able to get a lot more money out. Now, of course, in Uber's case and in the classic Silicon Valley stories, there's this whole sort of pyramid scheme of speculation. So it's not sort of this one-to-one, you invest $100,000, we use it to make something, we sell that thing for $200,000, you get your $100,000 back with interest. It's not a loan, it's equity. And there's multiple rounds of people buying each other out, which in itself is fascinating from an anthropological perspective, that how people understand value and how these capital markets are structured. But returning to just the question of putting this together, you basically need 5 things to run a company like this. You need drivers, you need riders, you need technology, you need people who know how to operate the technology to create a marketplace between drivers and riders, and you need capital to set it all in motion. And so essentially, over about a year and from the beginnings of this project, which was with a group of drivers, where we actually looked at all kinds of cooperatives. We looked at how could, maybe you mind if I digress here a little bit, with drivers, the problem is not only that the app is taking 25%, 30%, 40%, sometimes more of their income. The problem is that the other half of their income is being eaten up by the expenses for their vehicle financing, for gas, for insurance, for car washes, for repairs. And so in a cooperative, our cooperative is actually trying to attack this problem from both sides, both by creating our own app so that this commission is not extracted, but also by using cooperative power to get better deals on the inputs drivers need to do their jobs. So for example, we have a partnership with a credit union where drivers can get much better financing to buy a vehicle. And we're working on other types of, we call it solidarity economy partnerships, where we work out partnerships with auto repair shops so drivers can get discounts there and so on. Sort of integrating a little bit of planning into the market economy of this sector. But the question of putting it all together, we worked on all the pieces at the same time. There was sort of a core of drivers who were very inspired by this idea, who came together as a kind of organizing committee and advisory committee. I also directly reached out to former managers of the corporate platforms. We brought on board, and later on, a former manager of Uber found us. Her name's Alyssa Orlando. She's one of the co-founders of the cooperative. And so she had the know-how of exactly how to do this. I mean, I would literally go on LinkedIn and message people and ask them, "Are you interested?" People who there was a company called Juno in New York City, which had some equity for drivers, and it shut down. And so I reached out to their former staff, and some people were interested in working with us. For riders, that was kind of the last piece to be put in place. We've had which we haven't really started working on until like 2 weeks ago. And it's been frankly fairly easy. We've gotten so much attention. Riders are finding us. So we have many thousands of people have downloaded the app. The other piece, the technology, this is kind of where I guess let me talk about the technology and then the capital. The technology, I was very surprised to find people think that you have to build everything from scratch. Well, that's not the case. As soon as Uber came along and created a app-enabled dispatch system, every taxi company basically on the planet went out and tried to buy or build the same thing. And so this led to the creation of an entire global industry of software providers that build this kind of software. And so there are many kind of, you could call them off-the-shelf options that they usually require customization, and they're of kind of varying quality that you can use, that you can in effect buy. So in this sense, we can actually just buy the means of production or license it or lease it. And in a very interesting way, this was probably, sometimes I compare what we're doing to like, the auto industry in the 30s. In the 1930s, it would have been crazy for workers to get together and say, you know what, instead of working for Ford, we're going to start our own auto company across the street. The barriers to entry were so much higher then. The amount of capital you would need to do that would be way out of reach. But I think a couple of things have happened since then. One is in the digital economy, the price of the means of production is constantly falling. Because as soon as there's an innovation, there's immediately a million copycats. And in fact, there are companies that establish them as copycats only in order to be bought up by the bigger players. It's a dynamic in the software industry. That's considered a success if you make your company enough of a competitor that they get purchased. But the other aspect is that there's this transition from a kind of Fordist system of production where you have Ford's River Rouge plant where steel goes in one end and cars come out the other, and the company owns everything in between, to a post-Fordist system where you have maybe Ford is like a management team in a corporate office, and then it has contracts with dozens or hundreds or thousands of other companies and suppliers, all of which could also, in most cases, contract with you. You can actually, what this sort of fissuring of the corporation or splintering of the corporation does is it means that even small players are able to contract with, are able to bring together the same elements that the big players have, often not at quite the same scale, often not at quite the same quality, but nevertheless, the elements are there for sale in the marketplace, and you can create a competitor. You can add to that the fifth piece, capital. And that, of course, that's one of the biggest challenges because it's a definitional challenge that workers don't have capital. The cooperative movement is about 150 years old and has built institutions. And so there are lending institutions that will finance projects like ours. And so that was a major ingredient in the success that we had. We were able to get financing from a cooperative a financial institution called Shared Capital Cooperative, which is basically a credit union of cooperatives that exists only to finance cooperatives. On top of that, the other tool we've been able to use is crowdfunding. We were able to tap directly into the enormous public desire for a worker-owned alternative to raise money. And we're about to take that a step farther in the coming week with the launch of a major crowdfunding. We did crowdfunded donations. We're about to do crowdfunded investments, which is sort of a fascinating tool that just wasn't available even a decade ago, which we'll see. I think there's some interesting theory out there about how these tools are enabling small players to compete with big players. The bar to entry is lower than it may have been in the past. So that's kind of the long and the short of how we put these elements together. I mean, it's kind of what's interesting to me is like another thing is just you can probably tell I'm not a person who I don't have a lot of like. I don't really like capitalism, I would say, it's not really about whether capitalism is good or bad. It's just what is, and understanding it, and understanding there's both good and bad elements of it. Good and bad aren't even useful adjectives. It's just understanding what is it, how does it work, what are the tendencies latent within it, what are the potential trajectories of transformation, who are the different agents who are impacted by these trends, where would they like to see the future go. A lot of this project really originated in asking a group of drivers in New York City, how would you like this industry to be organized if you were the owner? And then getting the resources to make that true. So I can actually show you, I have a prop here. All members of the cooperative become shareholders. This is a share certificate.
Okay.
This is a very old-fashioned tool. You don't have to, most companies don't issue share certificates. We decided it was important it's a symbol. So from an anthropology.
How many people are now the shareholder in the cooperative?
Right now, hundreds. We've just started issuing shares. We do ceremonies where people come collect their shares. We've done two so far. We've issued a few hundred shares, and we have a few thousand members though. So soon it will be a few thousand. Yeah, there's over 2,500 drivers on the platform.
A huge potential there. Yeah. No, I absolutely agree, Erik. As you said, this is spirit of experimentation, also the spirit of our department. It's not to make any blanket judgment, but it's really look at the operational processes and then how can we creatively bring elements together. And in order to do that, we have to have a very clear analysis of how things work, right? So here, I mean, a small side question is that should we call the money is that you raised capital, or we should you need to invent another term to distinguish this kind of money mainly as a means of actually it's mainly as a means of recording a transaction and also as a means of transaction itself, rather than the means to generate more profit, right? So it's a kind of it's really a tool for just have a record of what's going on. So I don't know whether or not in the future we can even incorporate like a blockchain technology in order to facilitate that process. So anyways, the concept of capital, because we can turn the money into another different animal altogether.